Welcome to Stem Cells from the Sofa, a virtual seminar series hosted by Stem Cell Network and designed to reconnect researchers and bring expert content to your sofa. My name is John Draper and I am Program Director of Research and Partnerships at the Stem Cell Network. And today we're talking regulatory related science. So some questions. We're seeing a big uptick in the number of cell therapies moving into clinical trials, but meeting the regulatory requirements necessary for a new cell or gene therapy to reach the clinic can appear to be significant hurdles to academics who may be more familiar or comfortable with discovery-related work. What are the critical regulatory stages, and which planning strategies can smooth the path towards successful clinical translation? When is the right time to start thinking about the regulatory components? And which regulatory elements can an investigator tackle themselves, and which elements are best expedited by seeking regulatory expertise? To find out these answers to these questions, we're very fortunate to be joined by regulatory expert Patrick Bedford, who is the founder and principal consultant of We Can Reg Consulting Group, Inc. So, I mean, everybody's familiar with Zoom by now, but it is all about questions. This Stem Cells from the Sofa. This allows you to interact with the expert speakers. So please do make sure that you're using the Q&A box dialogue here to actually type in your questions. You can do this at any point during the talk, and we'll save those questions and I'll present them to Patrick at the end. So back to Patrick, eh? So I'll introduce Patrick here. So Patrick is an experienced and certified regulatory professional focused on facilitating global regenerative medicine developments in Canada. He now leads We Can Reg Consulting Group, Inc., which is an emerging regulatory consulting company that provides regulatory planning, interaction, and submission services. Prior to incorporating his own company, Patrick developed regulatory consulting services for CCRM, planned 2 Canadian CAR-T new drug submissions for Celgene Inc., and led teams at Health Canada responsible for developing guidance and policies for biosimilars, transplant materials, and cell and gene therapies. And I'll just pause here for a moment and say that these are the same policies that are in use now and that you will have to navigate if you're thinking about taking a cell and gene therapy through the regulatory steps necessary to move it to the clinic. So Patrick is a leading expert on these matters and well worth listening to on the insights that he has. So while leading these policy initiatives at Health Canada, Patrick supported their therapeutic products classification committee, chaired the cells, tissues and organs classification committee, and championed international harmonization initiatives. He remains an active member of the ISCT North America LRAC, and you can tell me what that stands for, Patrick, and Health Canada's Cell Therapy Stakeholders Group, which I'm more familiar with. And indeed, through these stakeholder groups, Patrick continues to have a hand in helping to shape policies, regulatory policies. So finally, Patrick completed his Honours Bachelor of Health Sciences degree at the University of Western Ontario, a Master's degree in Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Otago, which is in New Zealand, and obtained a Regulatory Affairs certificate from the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. And so, Patrick, thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess I should probably start by checking you can hear me. I assume I've unmuted it successfully.
You are? Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
And maybe my next step is to say what the LRAC is. It's the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Committee for the International Society for Cell Therapy. So a group focused on international regulatory approaches for cell therapy. And now I guess the next task, I have to figure out how to share my screen successfully. We did go through this before, so hopefully no hiccups.
Yeah, I can see it now. Yeah.
Perfect. And it should be a full screen presentation just with the title slide.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you.
So Patrick, I'll just move out of the way and I'll let you speak then, okay?
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And thank you very much, John, and Stem Cell Network for inviting me to speak today and for working with me to develop some tools that we are putting on your website that can help the community. So I do want to highlight that this presentation will refer to 2 tools that are on the Stem Cell Network website, and I encourage people to have a look at them. I'll go over them in a little bit. Also, thank you to everybody who registered and who's participating live, or any of you who are watching in hindsight. Today, I hope you'll leave with some insights into how and when you can augment your research plans with regulatory tools. And I have to say, I'm excited to reconnect with many of you. I've known many of you when I worked at Health Canada and at CCRM, and I've had less opportunity to get out and present in the last while, partly because of COVID, but also for the past 2 years when I worked at industry, I wasn't able to get out and speak at conferences like TILA-McCullough as often. So I'm really excited to get back and to tell you first a little bit about We Can Reg. I'll just take maybe 30 seconds to add on to what John said, which is that I'm really here, and my goal is to facilitate global regenerative medicine in Canada. So that really is helping with planning, early development, and encouraging earlier regulatory planning to support your interactions with Health Canada, to get the most out of them and to give you confidence and to help address issues. People are saying that regulatory uncertainty is one of the biggest challenges in this field, so I really want to help out address that. And also, I can accelerate some of your regulatory submissions. And really what I've done is I've taken 15 years of knowledge, experience, tools, things like that, and the residual knowledge from that to turn them into checklists, annotated templates that are easy to use, and other things like that. So that's what I'm doing now, and without further ado, I'll jump in to what we're talking about today. I do have my first slide is talking about regulatory affairs, so really high level. This is important that you understand my philosophy and approach to understand what I'm going to be saying today. And first I want to address, is regulatory affairs a science or an art? There's a lot of people who say regulatory affairs is a science and it's rules-based and there's right and wrong answers. And I do not take this perspective very far. I think it may work for pharmaceutical products with a lot of guidance documents and clear expectations, and it's a well-trodden path. But to me, regulatory affairs in emerging biotech, and especially in cell and gene therapy, is really a bit more of an art of navigating regulatory interactions by communicating scientific and clinical information effectively. To me, the answer is not always clear, and there's not always a right or wrong. I think you have to think a lot more in terms of implications of your decisions, and that requires knowledge and experience. And as I said, this is more important for cell and gene therapies. And I want to say it up front because it sets your expectations. When you ask me questions later and say, is this how you do it or is that how you do it? My answer will probably start with, well, it depends. And when you go to speak with the regulator, you'll note that pre-submission meetings, things like that, if you ask them questions, there's rarely a very clear answer. It's, well, you should think about this when you do it that way. And I'll be talking a bit like that today. So I apologize in advance, but now you've been warned. So ultimately, today's goal is going to encourage you to regulatory DIY or do it yourself early in development, and to think about regulatory earlier in development, and to provide you some tools and some high level information that will help you do that. I'll take about 10 minutes to discuss when and how you should start thinking about regulatory affairs during the commercialization pathway. And I'll take about 20 minutes to introduce the 2 new planning tools that I've talked about, the annotated templates that will be on Stem Cell Network's website. And I'll take about 5 minutes to talk about how you can plan to approach the regulator and when you should start that planning process. I'll take about 5 minutes to demystify what a regulatory submission actually looks like. It's a bit of a nebulous term, again, that people say, oh, well, the submission is this. But I remember earlier in my career when I thought, well, what's the actual submission look like? So I've tried to put it into a bit of a visual that we can go over quickly. That should leave us plenty of time for question and answers. But if you do have a question that you can't ask today or we don't have time, or that comes to you later, I remain available. I love to answer questions, so please reach out to me. My contact information is available at the end of the slide deck. So here in this slide, you see a timeline. It's a commercialization pathway. You're probably familiar with this. If you're part of Stem Cell Network and you're part of the research community, you are the expert in drug discovery, and you have access to tech transfer offices that can help you with getting patents for your discoveries, and you can work with groups that are emerging to develop your marketing plans and your investment pitches and things like that. And in cell and gene therapies, you probably have more experience moving even further down the commercialization pathway into conducting your own pivotal studies in animals that will enable clinical trials, or planning those at least, or moving manufacturing into labs that can actually support human studies and things like that. But not many of you have gone too far past that. I mean, some of you may have, or may have experience from industry, but a lot of technologies at this point do get licensed out to industry, and they're kind of more of the experts in completing the commercialization pathway. So just to go over the steps that are involved in commercialization after transfer and maybe your first in human studies, or sometimes before. Really, you have to lock down on your plans and your process, and kind of stop the innovation at some point, so that you can move forward with a product that is going to stay the same for a period of time, and that you're going to gather evidence to support. And you'll have to plan your regulatory submissions in detail. You'll have to conduct your own health technology assessments, and then ultimately develop marketing plans and launching tools to help you succeed. And I really think that anybody who is thinking of developing a new product from scratch and creating a company needs to start thinking about this entire commercialization pathway earlier. Also, if you're not planning on going through the entire commercialization pathway and you're thinking of licensing out to industry or some other group, it really is helpful to think really broadly about commercialization as well, because you'll increase the value and the credibility of your story and your marketing plan when you do license it out. So think about commercialization along this entire pathway. This is not always linear, and you could have many different steps that you could put in here. So this diagram, take it for what it's worth. It's just an illustration of major activities that you'll need to think about. But to be honest, I've seen some some grant submissions, and I've been asked to help review them. And they looked a bit like this to me. So you can see in this pathway, not all the details are filled out. Typically you're asked for like an 18-month or a 3-year or 5-year plan. And it seems to me that some researchers just pull a number out of the hat and say, well, we're going to approach the regulator at this point. It lacks sufficient detail to be credible. And I think you could say, well, who cares what you think from a regulatory perspective, Pat? But keep in mind, I was helping a person, an investor, a grant agency, look over submissions to see how credible they are and which ones are going forward. And there are a lot of ways that you can augment your plans to make them more credible. And so I think you miss an opportunity if you don't develop this further. And what I call that missed opportunity is regulatory risk. Really, these are risks to your investment. And the perfect example is where you could have a device, a mesh or something like that, for example. That's your discovery that you can seed with stem cells. And let's say you could use it in a knee to address arthritis or something like that. So it's a scaffold that's intended to reduce inflammation and increase healing. And you could develop your plan and say, I'm going to file into regulatory in 18 months, and we're going to get a medical device approval because it's a structure, and we're filling a body structure, so it's a device, and then move along that path and invest into all the studies needed to support a device. But if you haven't put into your plan and an expectation that you're going to interact with the regulator to ensure that you got the classification right and other studies are acceptable, then I think that's what I'm talking about, the regulatory risk. It's quite possible that if you're developing a cell-seeded scaffold, that it's viewed as a drug and not a device. And if you can build additional regulatory steps or involve regulatory expertise in your planning, you can address these risks earlier and avoid investing into things that ultimately may or may not work. So I do have a better solution. This is my philosophy, and what I call it is mixing regulatory do-it-yourself with a light touch regulatory expert. And this doesn't have to break the bank. This is actually could be a cost-effective way of working with regulators and using regulatory expertise earlier in development to accelerate your pathway and to save you money and to avoid regulatory risk. So it involves obviously a touch base with a regulatory expert during planning. So this isn't you're just planning by yourself. You could take your plan, get a confidentiality agreement, or hire somebody who has some regulatory background and get them to look over your plan and see if they have anything to add. You can then use regulatory expertise to help you plan to approach regulators earlier in development and get more out of those meetings. And one thing I should note, in this diagram, I've moved a circle up after planning because regulators do encourage cell and gene therapies to come early and come often. And part of it is to address, to make sure you have the right classification and other things are clear to you. So I encourage this earlier. Then I think you could have a light touch regulatory. This is just ad hoc when issues arise. You could involve regulatory expertise. Again, whether they're hired, whether they're a consultant, whether you're just learning yourself, but you should be thinking from a regulatory perspective even early in development. And then ultimately, you would obviously have a lot of regulatory expertise required when you're filing a regulatory submission. But I highlight this circle is not fully red. I do believe that decision makers and companies do have to be involved in regulatory submissions and really educate themselves and work with regulatory expertise to understand the implications of their decisions. I think this approach will really allow regulatory expertise to inform and augment your plans, and at a time when you can actually listen to them. So the ability to impact decisions is much more effective earlier in development, and that's when you should be involving regulatory expertise. And finally, by taking this approach, you actually might be saving some money. You're developing trust. You're handing regulatory experts fewer documents and getting them to understand your product and your approach earlier in development with small light touch input. And by the time you get to regulatory submissions, they're already familiar with your product. They can give you really good advice. And ultimately, I think this will lead to more efficient and effective planning. So I guess that's it from my kind of early planning philosophy and commercialization, where regulatory fits in the commercialization pathway. So now I'll jump into some specific activities that you should be doing during planning that involve regulatory. And as I said, this is minimal investment and minimal regulatory expertise required. I also note that this is easier than you expect you already have a lot of information in your granting applications, publications, things like that, that easily translate into regulatory plans and can be understood by a regulatory expert and will really inform your overall development. So I encourage you to do this. And I also want to highlight there's a lot more out there than you expect. There's a lot more publicly available information, whether it's guidance documents from regulators or published documents when a product's approved. Some of you may or may not know that a certain amount of that information is going to be public and you can look at and learn from. So here's where I'm introducing you to the new tools that are developed to you, for you and are on the Stem Cell Network website. Don't worry about reading the text. Obviously, this text is tiny. You'll never be able to read it. But what I've done is up on the left there, you see just a snapshot of the Stem Cell Network Accelerating Clinical Translation program. And I just took that snapshot to say, you've already written pages and pages of what your plan is for the next 18 months, 3 years, 5 years. And I'm not suggesting you recreate that. You can take that and then use it as you develop your plans for, you see on the right now, 2 documents. One is about your manufacturing development plan, and that's the quality target product profile. And the other plan that you see there is a target product profile, which is your clinical plan. These are annotated templates, meaning that the black text is intended to be part of the templates, your headings. The red text is intended to be helpful. It's suggestions, questions you should answer, guidance. It'll give you some references into places where you can look to get information to start augmenting and really using regulatory tools to develop your research proposal plans into more practical regulatory development plans. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is that the 2 tools that we've developed are planning tools. They're not actually regulatory submission documents. You'll never provide these to a regulator, but I'll go into how these planning tools can be used and what they are in the next few slides. So the first tool is an annotated target product profile. And for those of you not familiar with this already, it's an optional planning tool. You don't ever even have to write this. It's based on a US FDA, so the US regulator guidance document for what you should start thinking about when you start developing a product. And it's mainly focused on clinical topics or targets. And it's never set in stone. This is an evolving document that will change over time. And I finally just say that there's a lot of templates out there. I encourage you to use the one that we've developed for the stem cell network and on the website, because it's focused and adapted to cell and gene therapies. But there's others out there that you could look at and use. And even the headings aren't set in stone. You can start tweaking it as you get a little bit more familiar with some of the things that you need to think about for your own needs. So in a second, just to show a little bit more what is involved, you'll see a high-level table of contents on the right. It's hidden right now because I won't be going through it in detail, and I want to highlight, first of all, the target product profile. We'll first talk about how the product, how you expect it will be used. It's a dream right now, but it should be based in reality and become more real over time. It'll also explain how it won't be used. These are subpopulations that you expect wouldn't be able to respond to it, or have maybe you want to target later, things like that, or adverse reactions that similar products have had, so you can start thinking about how it shouldn't be used, or how it will be dangerous to use in certain populations. And it will also start to contain the type of data that you think will be needed to support the safety and effectiveness of the drug. Again, this will all change as you know more about your product. Now you see the table of contents, and you can see all the little headings that I've used in this particular example. You see two columns also for preferred outcomes and clinical and critical outcomes. This is where you set what the bare minimum is you think is to get to succeed, or what your target, what your real hope is. And it's just because you have to play within that area. And you may recognize some of these headings from a product monograph. For those of you not familiar, a product monograph is a company's document that is approved by the regulator and negotiated with the regulator to say what the products can and can't be advertised for, and it's the official information to support the use of a product once it's approved. You obviously won't have the product monograph in mind before your first in human studies. It's way too early. Maybe you'll get it towards pivotal clinical studies. But in the meantime, the TPP, the target product profile, is really, in scientific terms, it's your hypothesis that you're setting out to challenge. And I'll just do an example of how working through a process when you think about a target product profile can help you refine and create a more realistic plan. So an example is for an emerging immunotherapy, let's call it a CAR T. You could say, well, look, let's say the first two approved CAR Ts are targeting lymphoma, and the next ones will target AML and multiple myeloma. And in your granting application, you'd say, well, we have something that can target multiple myeloma or lymphoma, and there's this many people in the population who have that, and we'd expect to treat a quarter of them just because of competition at first, and then you develop a marketing plan. Well, you can actually do a lot more by digging into product monographs of other products and things like that to say what the actual realistic indication might be. And you'll learn, because there's other products out there and these products are high risk, you're actually going to be stuck pretty closely to what you can conduct your clinical trials in. And that will be a subpopulation of the larger population. It will include people with large unmet needs. So for example, people who are relapsed on other drugs and refractory to them, and maybe even specific types of drugs. And your indication statement might change from, we're going to treat multiple myeloma, into relapsed refractory multiple myeloma that have been treated with various other drugs, and including this line of therapy, for example. So this process will really push you to write that down into a target product profile to have an augmented plan and realistic expectations about what your indication statement might mean. So this can be used, in this process, it can be used, as I mentioned, to have a more realistic pitch to venture capitalists who are very aware that drugs aren't used in the entire population right up front. And if you show the extra work that you've done to decide where you might fit and what a more realistic plan might look like, you might get some better feedback, and regulators would appreciate it too. It can be used to orient new team members and consultants quickly, because you could just hand them this document. It might be 10, 20 pages, and give them an idea of what you're all working towards. You can improve consistency and efficiency in document development, including regulatory documents via cut and paste. I said this isn't going to be used as a regulatory submission document, but components of it can be, and anyone who's worked with regulators knows that you have to put a basic description of what you're doing and your product in an email when you request a meeting, in a briefing book, in a presentation deck, in introductory statements, into summary documents. And so if you have something central that will help you develop your plan, such as this tool, it'll be really helpful. And this tool will also help with change management. Okay, so that was all the target product profile, all the clinical plan. The other tool is about manufacturing. This is also an optional dynamic planning tool that will change over time. The difference is that this is not as easy to find. There aren't a lot of quality target product profiles out there. And this one that I've developed is intended to support cell and gene therapies, so it hopefully will be a little more helpful. And finally, this one's unique because it introduces concepts of quality by design. And this is really important for cell and gene therapies. And just to push that home a little further, Scott Gottlieb, who's the US FDA commissioner, the former one, said a number of years ago that for the average regulatory submission, 80% of the issues are clinical issues and 20% are manufacturing issues. But the opposite is the case for cell and gene therapies. So cell and gene therapies, most of the issues that you may experience from a regulatory perspective deal with manufacturing. So you really have to have a plan for how to address the complexity of cell and gene therapies, and this will help start to do it. So for those of you not familiar with quality by design, I'll get into what it is using an analogy, but I will recognize there's far too many acronyms, and this may be new to some of you, so I'll try and hopefully use this analogy to help. So first of all, actually, let me take a small step back. Quality by design just fundamentally is an approach to understanding your product manufacturing by focusing on the clinical relevance. It helps you to de-risk your manufacturing development over a product's life cycle. And the analogy I'll use is baking. So in baking, you have ingredients. If I'm baking an apple pie, I know that the apples are extremely important. It tastes different if I use a Macintosh versus a Red Delicious versus, so I know the ingredients, but then there's some ingredients that may or may not be important. So things like sugar, can I use brown sugar or white sugar? There are things that you can replace. So this is a way of thinking about your ingredients to identify which ones actually have an impact that matter. And if you start thinking about this, then you can focus on them and make investments differently and learn about them and really experiment with them early on to understand the implications of change. Similarly, when you bake a pie, the ingredients important, but also the process. When do you add the ingredients? What equipment do you use? Do you use an oven? What temperature? Do you may have to leave it sitting after, and things like that. And then how important is the temperature? Can you have a 10-degree fluctuation or a 20-degree? And these things are things you should be asking and understanding what's important, and that's called understanding your critical process parameters. And together, the ingredients and the baking instructions will give you a taste, and your target is to get a good tasting pie. And what I'd liken that to is a critical quality attribute. So these are things that have clinical significance, whether they're going to be related to safety or effectiveness. You have to understand your product. So altogether, quality by design will let you understand your product and the ingredients and the process and everything, and figure out better how you need to think about this throughout development. And we all know there's good bakers out there and bad bakers out there, and the good bakers are able to take what they know and their experience, learn from it, and then bake in a different kitchen and experiment with different ingredients and understand what it could do. So these concepts are all integrated into a quality target product profile to start thinking about earlier in development. Ultimately, as I said, this is going to help you earlier. It will help you maybe even select your contract development and manufacturing organization, or who you're going to be working with, or to communicate with them. Once you've selected them, you could say, look, this is what we know about our product. We know that these steps are extremely important, these critical process parameters. Are you able to accommodate those? So it'll really help those discussions. And then other than that, I've just relisted what the benefits are, or how you could use the TPP. They're similar for the QTPP. So you can rapidly orient new team members, use it for regulatory cut and paste, and manage your change over time. So that's it for the tools, and I hope that you find them useful. I encourage you to look on the Stem Cell Network website to see how helpful they are. I also want to note that they will evolve over time, so I'm receptive to feedback, and I'd like to make this a community tool to make sure that they help people translate their research plans into regulatory plans. So now I'll jump into, and I said I'll take maybe 5 minutes, and I think I will, to talk about regulatory interactions. A reminder, I think you need to have some moderate investment in regulatory expertise at this stage. And really it's to give you more confidence and to get more out of interactions with regulators. And I think the tools and experience that a regulatory expert, whether they're in-house or not, can offer will really pay in dividends. But I'll explain some of the activities that will happen for those of you not familiar. So first of all, a regulatory expert can help you speak the language. Speaking the language is not required, it's not a requirement, but things can go much more smoothly if you understand different terminologies. I don't know how many times I've heard Health Canada called the agency. They're not an agency. It's like nails on chalkboard. I don't know if it's just when I was there or if they feel that way too. And the review group's a directorate. But more importantly, if you're going to be talking to a regulator, you want to be able to cite the right documents and to, for example, transplantation regulations. If you're screening your material, you want to know what requirements there are and to demonstrate to the regulator that you've done your homework. So try to speak the language. So a pre-submission meeting is really an opportunity to talk to the regulator for free for non-binding advice. And get some input onto your planning and your submissions. And I say there's no direct cost because obviously there is a cost in terms of resources. You need to take the time to plan to have a good interaction, and you may need to involve external experts at some point. But ultimately, this is an opportunity to talk about your manufacturing, your clinical questions. It could be to discuss regulatory pathways and special designations and things like that. So that's the point, and usually you get 5 to 10 questions are pretty much allotted just time-wise. You can get into detail on 5 to 10 major questions, so you want to be very selective with what questions you have. And the process, I really wanted to focus on that. You have to provide sufficient information to support your conversations, and you need time to prepare that. So really what I tell people is you really should be planning for any pre-submission for clinical trials about 6 to 9 months before the date that you want to submit your clinical trial application. And I say that because Health Canada's requirement is to have 3 months in advance for your meeting date. So that means you have to send in your request and really a justification for why you want to talk 3 months in advance. There used to be a little more flexibility, but Health Canada is obviously really busy and has to prioritize their things right now. So this is really more than a suggestion now. You need to plan more than 3 months in advance. But I say 6 to 9 because I encourage people to remember that you have to have your meeting. Then it's about 2 weeks or 3 weeks to finish the meeting minutes officially. And then you have to address all of their feedback prior to submitting your clinical trial application. So factor that into your timeline plan as well. Yeah, and I think there's a number of reasons why you might want to have a meeting with Health Canada, and there's some really good reasons. So for example, any issues that you have, should be discussed in advance at any time you have an opportunity to do that. And that's because if you file a submission, you can't add new information onto it after it's been filed. And if Health Canada has a question and doesn't understand something or would have liked to see something different, you have only 48 hours to address their request for more information or for clarification. So you want to have this meeting to avoid having to provide information on a very tight deadline. Another benefit of having a pre-submission meeting, you can get to know some of the Health Canada reviewers and what their focus is on your submission, and you can augment that prior to submitting. Also, they get to know you, and it's the beginning of a relationship and a trusting relationship. So this is very important. And finally, I know and I recognize that not everybody's developing a drug specifically for Canada. There are other larger markets out there. And I encourage people also, this is, in my mind, a good reason to approach Health Canada. You can get practice prior to approaching other regulators. So Health Canada, in my opinion, and I've heard many other people say, they're very approachable, very helpful, very open. And so I encourage people to go and talk to Health Canada. And not everybody knows, but Health Canada and other regulators talk. So when I was at Health Canada, they had cluster meetings and they met with FDA, US FDA, the European Medicines Association, that's the EMA, and the Japanese PMDA, their regulator in Japan, every 3 months. And they talked about regulatory policy issues and submission issues that they're encountering so that they can think a little bit more alike. So speaking to Health Canada is indirectly supporting your submissions elsewhere. They're also all members of the International Council or Conference on Harmonization, so their perspectives should be very similar. Of course, there are reasons not to approach the regulator, and I think number one is if you're not willing to listen to feedback, or if you can't for whatever reason, let's say you have already locked in your manufacturing and you already have the product, I wouldn't start asking questions about how you should do it, because ultimately you'll have to document the minutes and then address that in your submission. If you know you can't listen to them, just file a submission, be very open, provide all the information that they need to make a decision, and move ahead with your submission. Also, if you're willing to fail and you don't have time, don't have a CTA, a pre-CTA meeting, I'm sorry. So for example, if you have to file within 2 months, you can't get a meeting and get feedback, but you can file a CTA and have it reviewed in 30 or now 45 days. And if there's an issue, you can always resubmit it. And if that's better for your timeline, it's not encouraged, but it's possible that you may not want to have a pre-CTA. There's also some bad reasons, like if you're afraid of interacting with the regulator, I'd encourage you to just overcome that fear, whether you need to work with somebody who's got more experience, but there are other reasons. And I think some people have, rightly or wrongly, are concerned that if they go to multiple regulators, they get different advice and not be able to address it all. So that's another reason why you might not want to go to the regulator, and I understand that. But I think you need to navigate that issue, and there's other ways to address that. I don't have too much time. I know I'm falling behind a little bit because I want to leave time for questions. But the main purpose of this slide is to highlight how interchangeable or how supportive one pre-submission meeting is to another. So if you go to Health Canada, all the materials you've developed to go to Health Canada can be repurposed. They'll have to be changed a little bit, but to approach the US regulator as well. The requirements, the process is the same. You send a request with more or less similar information, sometimes a bit more, but you need to develop a briefing book that provides context to the questions that you're going to ask. So that can be repurposed. And then ultimately you'll have your meeting and develop meeting minutes. And the approach from doing it with one regulator will really help you approach another regulator. So there's synergies here. So that's it for your pre-submission meeting, to demystify it a bit. Now I'm going to hopefully demystify what a regulatory submission looks like a little bit. Again, just a reminder, at this stage, you're investing more in regulatory. You may want to accelerate your submission material, and you definitely want to avoid rejection of submissions, especially later stage ones that can cost more money. And you can do that by having the right content and the right format. So in regulatory submissions, content is king. Regulators really just want to make sure there's enough evidence to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risk of a high quality product. But the format does matter. If you can imagine, the regulatory submissions for a new drug submission are thousands and hundreds of thousands of pages of data and information. And so it's all organized in a way that they can expect it, because ultimately when it gets to the regulator, they subdivide it and hand it out to different experts. And they have to know how to do that. So format is important. Just a word on content. There's kind of two theories for approaching content. I personally really endorse the first. I think regulators really appreciate open and transparent communication. I would never suggest anybody ever does or should hide information, but the second theory is just provide anything that's directly relevant and include what you must and what guidance it suggests to include. But there's something to be said for both approaches. Again, nobody should hide any information from regulators. That's extremely dangerous to do and not recommended. But I just wanted to note that there are two approaches to what you should be including. Now, just to visualize a submission, I know, again, this diagram you shouldn't be able to read. Maybe you can, but it's available online. It comes from the International Council for Harmonization. So this involves multiple regulators, including Health Canada, who's a full member. And what it's intended to do is illustrate how a document should be put together. And it's based on 5 major components, all subdivided with headings. And if you can envision, it's like a document or a novel with an index, and it just says where you should be putting the information. And Module 1 is really your administrative information. It'll be different in different regions. And the rest are intended, they're not quite, but to be cut and paste or mirrored all around the world, so you don't have to redevelop it all. And Module 2 is just the summaries, so the quality summaries, the non-clinical and clinical summaries of safety and effectiveness. Module 3 is focused on manufacturing information, and Module 4 is your non-clinical information, your in vitro and in vivo studies. And Module 5 is your clinical information and clinical study reports. And all of them, all that data will be organized there and under very specific and pre-specified headings. So just to illustrate a little further, for first-in-human clinical trial application, to visualize it, Module 1 will be about 15 Canadian-specific documents and forms. These are submission forms, fee forms, which are not applicable. You don't pay, but you have to fill out, I think, for the clinical trial application. Your investigator's brochure, things about your research ethics boards, the sites that you're going to be using in Canada, things like that. Module 2 will really contain information about how your product's manufactured. That's about a 40 to 80 page document describing your manufacturing, and Module 3 contains additional information about your manufacturing. So that's, if you want to visualize in terms of documents or folders, you have these 3 folders, you have some subfolders within there, and then documents are placed in there with pre-specified headings, and it's filling in the blanks for your product. The US submission is a bit different, as I mentioned. There's a few less Module 1 documents. The summaries are still in Module 2, but they do request a bit more summaries, the non-clinical summaries, for example. Module 3, very similar. But then the US FDA, according to their guidance documents, requires the non-clinical reports and things to be added. And I'll just remind people that the FDA is much larger than Health Canada. Both of them have 30 days to review, so that might explain a bit of the differences in what's actually submitted. And I guess hopefully that demystified what a submission looks like. I hope that what you take out of everything I've said today is just start thinking about regulatory earlier, think about it gradually, do what you can by yourself, work with an expert to get templates and fill things out, and then graduate a little bit further to when you're having a pre-submission meeting, maybe consider doing it yourself, but maybe having some support as required. Or think about whether you really want to involve an expert earlier in your interaction supports to get the most out of it. And then ultimately, I think you will need to use some regulatory expert, whether you need to hire them full-time or not, I don't know. But this will really help you accelerate your submission preparations. So I'm here, I want to help, I want to answer your questions, and specifically, as I mentioned, I want you to help you resolve issues, approach the regulator, accelerate submissions, and I'm available now for questions or via email if something comes to you later. And I guess with that, I should probably mute myself to see what John has to say and if there's any questions coming in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was extremely accessible, really easy to understand the process there, and those tools that you've made, they look like they're going to be really useful for the community. Thank you for that. So whilst I'm waiting for people to type in their questions, do that, please. It's really important that you use this opportunity to speak to an expert like Patrick, ask your questions. I've got a couple that I can ask. So I guess here's a good one to start with. What are the common mistakes people make when they begin to plan regulatory strategies? Or another way of thinking of this, where do academics struggle or fail most often?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would encourage people to start thinking about regulatory earlier. I think too many people are focused on the scientific and clinical issues and try and solve it without the regulatory tools that are available. Sometimes the answer is out there. And it's just a matter of finding it. So I think the biggest struggle is you need to think about it earlier, and it's really difficult to know where to look. And I guess the second piece of advice I can add is you're never just trying to solve a regulatory issue from one jurisdiction. So my approach is always look internationally first. The ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, is a great place to start. They've organized all of their guidance very well. So I'd start there and then look into different jurisdictions to get your advice. So start earlier, start internationally is my advice for issues. And as I mentioned, I think most of the time issues are focused on manufacturing. So that I'd encourage people to, in particular, for manufacturing, to do that.
So is this something that an individual can realistically tackle, or do you really need to be part of a team to be able to tackle the regulatory components of moving a cell therapy to the clinic?
Yeah, so the short answer is anybody can read a guidance document, but I think it really is important to work as a team or to engage an expert, because what I've experienced so far is when people read a guidance document, they don't trust their interpretation of it. And so then they become hesitant, and then things take a very long time. If you can get the confidence in your interpretation of a guidance document, you're going to move along much faster. So I guess therein lies the answer. You can do it yourself, and smart people will navigate that quickly, but you will always live with the concern that you're not reading all of the relevant guidance documents, or that you're interpreting it right. And so it is helpful to work with someone who may have more experience doing it, or may have access to more documents because they know of them. They're publicly available. It's finding them. Anybody who's stumbled around on Health Canada's website knows that they don't have everything, and there's efforts being done in Health Canada to do that, to address that. But that's where someone with regulatory expertise can and should help.
Fair enough. That's good advice. So here's a question that's coming in. So do you have any advice for how to seek appropriate regulatory experts or assess regulatory guidance?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll split it. I think there was two there. The first half of that is how to seek regulatory expertise, and I think there's three major approaches. One is, and it's like if you're looking for an appliance repairman, you can seek a buddy who's done it before successfully. You can go to a large company by Googling on a website, and there are some, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society or Canadian Association of Professional Regulatory Affairs, CAPRA, have lists of regulatory consultants. So you can kind of do that Google approach and then find a big company, or you can find a niche expert. And if I can just add a little bit of insights into each of them, I am an advocate of working with someone who's a certified regulatory professional. There's a regulatory affairs certificate you can get, and that is based on experience and knowledge and a test. And it says you know enough about a variety of regulatory issues, so you have some additional credibility and should be able to help. That's a small hanging fruit way of seeing if someone's qualified to help you. But a lot of people who have stumbled through a clinical trial application may not be the best person to go to. That you need someone who's got a little more experience with a variety of issues to be really helpful. And then the larger companies, I guess, you don't always know who they're going to put on the file and who you're going to be working with. So I obviously am partial and biased towards working with a niche regulatory expert. So someone who's got more experience and breadth of experience in cell and gene therapies in this area, I think is really helpful.
So I guess maybe a question that would, I think, put all of this in perspective. So what are the big issues that are facing cell and gene therapy from a regulatory perspective at the moment?
I'd say comparability, and comparability. I think this is going to be the biggest stumbling block for most people. And I think it's these comparability is associated with so many other issues. I think people are developing these, they're very expensive drugs, they're very complex on a smaller scale. And they know that if they're going to be used globally, they need to be done on a global scale or on a larger scale. And in order to do that, you need to understand the differences of when you manufacture in one place and in another place that's intended to get a larger population. If you can't do that, you'll be successful in clinical trials, you'll feel successful, you'll move things forward, but they'll never get here. I think it's one of the biggest cliffs that people are facing. And I think it's because you can stumble in through a clinical trial successfully and get really interesting data, but can you continue doing that when you make a change? And because these are so large and complex, and sometimes the mechanism of action is not really well known, this idea of comparability, tying together manufacturing and clinical relevance is so important. And that's why I added quality by design to the quality target product profile. Thinking about this earlier is going to help you. And I think a lot of people are going to fail. I think some of the first drugs that are approved in Canada are failing in comparability. I mean, I don't know a lot of details about it, but Prochymal was approved in 2012 and it was sold, and I don't know why it's not available. And I wonder if it's a comparability issue. And I think other people will face that. People who are in clinical trials right now, if they haven't planned to understand their product enough and to be able to overcome this issue of comparability when they move manufacturing facilities, I think are going to fail.
I guess this is particularly acute. I mean, with a drug, at least you can do assays to understand the drug structure, etc. With a cell therapy, they're little black boxes, and it's very difficult to appreciate some of the traits that they have.
And you bring up another important issue there is also the assays are new, and you'd have to transfer those into new facilities. So even our measurements of these products need to be comparable when you move them to different facilities and things like that. And we have to understand that they're not standard right now, so they're even harder to implement and to rely upon.
So I guess, how is the regulator dealing with this? Because clearly cell therapies are making it to the clinic, and so there seems to be some leeway for cell therapies, for cells products to be described in a way and then categorized and reproducibly made. I guess, how are they dealing with that?
You're right. They're employing flexibility right now. They're taking a risk-based approach, and they're encouraging a risk-based approach, and they're allowing companies to justify their approach and to fill in the blanks sufficiently. The other thing that's happening is, I think, there are some agencies out there that are starting to put together some guidance for this. So I think the European Medicines Association is maybe leading the way with discussions about comparability and what they call ATMP, Advanced Therapeutic Medicinal Products, involving cell therapy, gene therapy, and tissue engineered products. And they're providing specific guidance for this area. So they're emerging now. And so far they've tackled, I think, comparability and GMP specific for ATMP. So there's a lot going on in the space, but people are moving ahead at risk. And the only way you can do it is to take a risk-based approach to understanding your product and allowing flexibility in regulatory interpretation.
Okay, so one of the final questions that we have is, you mentioned regulatory expertise would be less expensive earlier on than later in development. How much are we actually talking?
That's a good question. It's a tough one. Obviously, starting my own company, I really tried to find out what people are charging and how they're approaching this. And just to give a bit of a ballpark to set expectations, there's a lot of variety. I've seen a really wide range, but most people are about $200 to $400 an hour. And so my comment about a little less expensive earlier in development than late is really based on the amount of hours people are putting into the efforts at the different stages. So earlier, you're reviewing documents, you're adding insights, you're referencing additional documents. These don't take a whole lot of time. And so what you're really doing is paying for the insights that they have, and most people boil it down to an hourly rate. And I think later in development, it can get quite expensive, and I say that because if you had a regulatory expert writing your submission documents, you're not paying a medical writer's fees. You're paying for this this other expertise that is not typically a high amount of hours. So it's quite a bit more expensive. And I just want to say a quick thing, that when you're looking to get regulatory expertise and when you're trying to find out what something should cost, really your first chat should cost nothing. You should be able to have an interaction with a regulatory expert to understand what they can offer you. They should be able to describe what it is you'll get that will help you move forward in terms of a deliverable. And then they should be able to estimate how many hours it is. And that's just as important as the hourly rate. So it's a multiplication. And I think that's why I've taken the approach of developing annotated templates that I can say, look, don't send me all your materials and have me write all of it. It's going to cost you too much. Instead, let's have a chat, understand your issue. I'll help you understand what it is I think you need, offer it, and then give a template to you that will help you understand. You can take it, think about it, develop it, send it back. I'll have a look at it. So that's why I suggest that approach can be cheaper and it's easier to do earlier in development.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. Fantastic. I don't think we've got any more questions coming in. So at this point, I'm just going to say thank you for spending the time with our community to share this, the insights that you've had. I think it's a really important aspect of translation that people don't potentially appreciate. It's manageable though. That's the important message here, and there is assistance if you need it. So with that, usually at this point I say, I tell you about what's next on Stem Cells from the Sofa, but this time I'm not. With Stem Cells from the Sofa is taking a break. We have TMM, our Tiller McCullough meeting is coming up. It's a virtual meeting. You can register at tillermccullough.ca. We've got a superb program of speakers and workshops and events there. I really encourage you to take a look at that. And please do stay tuned with Stem Cells from the Sofa on YouTube. We're going to be posting Patrick's talk there. There's other ones that from the past, we've had 11 Stem Cells from the Sofa. So that you can see past talks there. Keep in tune with Stem Cell Network through Twitter and our website as well. So it's at Stem Cell Network is the handle on Twitter. Thank you, Patrick, and have a good day.
Thank you.